I know this stuff is probably a bit vague and esoteric to start off with, but hopefully by the time we get through it, things will start to get a bit clearer and we'll get a clearer idea of where everything is going. But it's actually a difficult enough subject to get your minds around at the start. How do companies manage technology? Why is it important to manage technology? And I want to just go back to, before I kind of get into today's lecture, go back to that. I'm kind of organising this based around the different activities that companies take on in managing technology. So things like, how does a company acquire technology? So how does Apple get the technology to make an iPod or an iPad or whatever it is they're making? How do companies acquire? And that's what we're going to use today. How do they exploit that technology? So given that, maybe you're a pharmaceutical company and you've discovered a marvelous new formula that's going to cure every disease known to man, how do you exploit it? How do you get that into a product that is actually generating revenue for your company that you can ship out to people in a usable format and all that kind of stuff? How do you identify new technologies? How do you decide which are the technologies that are going to make sense for your firm, that your firm is going to be able to make a profit from, that you have the skills in your firm in terms of the marketing and whatever else to actually make a profit from them? How do you learn from that process? So that's the whole area of learning is extremely important, particularly for larger firms and how they move forward, how they retain the knowledge that's there. How do you protect your technology? Usually patents, and how do you use patents, but not always patents, and particularly for smaller companies, patents are very difficult to defend and very expensive to defend. So some companies will just work on secrecy. They just won't let anybody see what their process is. What's a good example of that? Secrecy? Coca-Cola, the formula for Coca-Cola? Nobody knows it. It's a secret. It's not patented. The thing about patenting for companies, and again, maybe if somebody is doing something that's very different, and particularly a smaller company, is that when you patent something, you actually have to disclose the whole patenting system, and we'll talk about it later on at a later lecture. The whole patenting system was originally devised in order to help technology to diffuse and help new ideas to kind of get around through communities. So the idea is with when you have a new technology, if you patent it, you reveal what it is to the industry and to all and sundry. But in revealing it, the patenting system protects that technology and says that's kept for you so that nobody else can use that without your permission or whatever else. But patenting does require that you reveal what the new technology is. And how do you select? What kind of ways do you decide which is the best technology for you to use? So those are the different activities. So every firm will takes part in those types of activities at different stages and in different amounts. But those are the activities that firms will get involved in when they're managing technology. And across the top here are just a selection of tools that firms will use. Okay, it's not everything, it's just a selection of kind of some key tools that firms will use in managing technology. And there are other tools. There are things like Lean and Six Sigma you could put in here as tools, because they're tools that will help you to be better in managing your technology. But we've just identified, and again I'm working from a text, they've identified 6 different tools, and we're going to have a look at those and a look at how you implement those and how you use them. So the activities are what companies do. The tools are specific instances of things that have been developed that are found to be useful in these different activities. So that's kind of what that mapping is about. And the series of papers that I've given you is based with one around each of the activities and each of the tools. That's kind of the format that we've set up. The initial case study is just looking at technology management in general, and we have 2 hours tomorrow, so we'll work in groups, in smaller groups tomorrow, and hopefully kind of break down and just see what do we want to do with this. And I'll talk to you a little bit tomorrow as well about how to write a report, how to cite things. Did Michal do anything about referencing and citing or any of that kind of stuff? No, I'll do that quite quickly with you tomorrow, so just to give you an idea of how to cite. Did people get the notes? Did I send you an email about those? Yes? Okay. Okay, you don't need to take them out now. Can I just tell, if anybody hasn't got those, you need to get them. So for the first 3 papers, I'll be sending them to you because I didn't include them in this. But after that, any of the papers I want you to read are in here. So it just means you pay €6 for kind of a reader as opposed to looking at paying 30 or 40 for a text. and have them broken down so it maps against, the paper against either the tools or towards the end of it, the activities, or towards the end of it against the different tools. So what I'm hoping we'll do as we go through is that we will read a paper and talk about it in the lecture so that you have a kind of a context. I use this set of papers and they're useful because they're mainly practically based. So they're mainly about how companies do these different things as opposed to theoretical models. So when I'm talking in the lectures, I'm going to be talking about theory and about kind of different models and different things that work. When we look at the papers that you're reading, it's going to be, well, how have companies actually implemented this and what have companies actually done? Was that yours? Okay, thanks. So that's kind of the setup. That's what we're going to be doing. Was there anybody who wasn't here last week who didn't get a course outline or details of the first assignment? No? Okay. There you go. What I'm going to do this Friday, the other thing I've done is that we're going to use a learning environment called Moodle. The rest of is anybody using Solus with you? Yeah? Who's using Solus? Which? For? All right, okay. Moodle is like Solus, it's just a different one, and I use Moodle because I'm familiar with it and I've got you all set up on Moodle. And on Friday, we'll be back over in the same lab, just for this Friday, the same place you were last Friday. And I'll just talk you through how you use Moodle and what you do with Moodle. So with the different papers that are in that, I'm going to hold off because I know you're doing this assignment, so I'll hold off maybe till the end of this week and we'll just have to catch up somewhere along the way. So for each paper that you read, I'm going to post a short question on Moodle, and what you have to go in is it's just to keep you on top of the papers. You'll have to read the paper and answer kind of a couple of little comments, but I'm only looking for about 200 words there, 200 or 300 words. So it's not, that's a paragraph, which is really just kind of in response to a question. So it means, have you read the paper, and can you answer kind of whatever it is that I'm asking you about the paper? So that's what we'll do on Friday. We'll go through Moodle and we'll see how Moodle works, and we'll have a look at what's up on Moodle for you. Okay. Okay, the other thing that I think, did I send you an email about this? Is everybody getting emails? If anybody isn't getting emails, will you come up and talk to me at the end of the lecture? Okay, because you're going to be missing out on a lot of stuff. And if you're not getting emails, that means you won't have an account on Moodle either, so you're in trouble. So if anybody isn't getting emails, let me know. The 2 site visits that I've organised, I've kind of said this to you already, on the 17th of October, which is in how many, about 3 or 4 weeks, about 4 weeks probably, we're going to go to Arabon Co-op in Nina, and we're just going to see how does technology have an impact on something like a co-op. So we have a bus organised, and I'll get back to you with full details of where the bus will be, but we have a bus organised to leave UL at 9 o'clock. Our visit starts at 10 o'clock. We should leave Arabon at 11:30. We'll be home here by kind of 12 or 1. So that's what you do. Have something on Wednesday after my lecture, don't you? No, you're all free until. Okay, so the rest of Wednesday is free, so this isn't going to clash with anything. Yeah? Oh, you're not sure what tutorials. Okay, well, once you know, we'll talk about that. Will you know by Friday what tutorials you're going to be at? You'll have to. Yeah, well, we'll talk about that on Friday, okay? We'll figure that out on Friday. So that's one of the visits. The other visit, like I said before, is down in Vistacon. And again, I just want to look at the contrast between a company that's producing a very high-tech product and a company that has an essentially low-tech product, milk and whatever else they produce there, but will be using technology at the same time to produce that and to manufacture it. So that's why we've kind of picked those 2 places to visit. Now, for today then, I'm going to talk today about technology acquisition. We're covering a lot of things here, so we're going to fly through. I want you to just get a concept of all of these things. You don't need to have to know everything in detail. We're short enough in time to do what it is we want to do, and we might come back to some things at the end of the module if we have time to return to them. So how do firms acquire new technologies? One of the first things, if you want to get involved in a technology-based product, you have to decide how you're going to acquire technology. Even if you're a manufacturing firm, as we'll see when we go out to Arabon, technology is important for you. And there are two basic ways, okay? You can basically develop it in-house, or you can go externally for your technology. Most of the bigger companies will develop, bigger companies actually do a lot of both. Like, if you look at any of, say, the big pharmaceutical or the biomedical companies, they do an awful lot of in-house R&D, but they also do quite a bit of external stuff. An awful lot of the medical devices companies, one of the ways that they acquire new technology is by buying small firms. So you very often see kind of small, high-tech medical devices firms that are set up specifically to be bought, like that's their intention. So their idea is to attract, some of the bigger companies to come in and buy them. And some of the bigger companies will use that as a way of looking at very new and very different technologies. You can look at how you acquire technologies in three different levels. You can either make stuff internally, you can collaborate, so you can work with somebody else to make it, or you can decide to just go and buy it. And in a way, collaboration is kind of the middle ground. So make is doing it all ourselves. Buying it, we're going totally outside to get our technology, but collaborate is somewhere in the middle. We're working with someone else to develop technology. And as I said, you can either look internally in-house, which is your make, and externally is, collaborate or buy will involve either inter-organizational relationships if you're buying, or something like an open technology or open innovation, which we'll look at in a minute. Again, if you're buying or if you're collaborating to develop technology. So if you're looking to buy technology, I'm just going to go through the three different elements here and see how we go. Take some notes, but I'm going to put all of these up on Moodle. So when we have access to Moodle from Friday onwards, you will get to see all the lectures. And I will also put the papers, okay, you have a copy of the papers in front of you, but I'll also put the PDFs of the papers up there as well, so that, you have the notes, and it's probably easier to read and to make notes, on the hard copy, but you'll also have a soft copy of everything there. But again, we'll go through that on Friday. So when you buy, who do you buy from? What are the different places that you can acquire technology if you want to buy it? You can buy it from universities, so university research spin-out companies based at the university. There are some kind of R&D centres, external R&D centres. I'm just going to open these windows because it's very warm in here. Will someone get that one down there and just push it open? Thanks. So you could look at an external R&D centre. We don't have so many of them in Ireland. We have a few. There's a microelectronics centre in Cork, for instance, that would be linked with the university, but is run as a separate organisation. So that would be an R&D centre. On the continent, you'd see more of those. In Europe and in the States, you'd see more of those. Consultants, licensing agreement. You can look to your vendors, people who are selling your products, or your suppliers. Or you can look at acquiring machinery. And in a lot of cases, acquiring machinery can be considered as a way to acquire new technology. So that would typically be a piece of manufacturing machinery. And that's probably what we're going to see out in Arabon. I haven't been out there, but I would imagine that a lot of how they've developed the technology that they're using to process their milk is through acquiring machinery. And what probably isn't listed here as well, bringing in new people is another way to acquire technology. So there are different kind of channels that can be used to buy new technology. When we're talking about make, then what are the channels for making, kind of doing it internally? It's mainly R&D, and we're going to have a look at R&D now in a minute. Collaborate, then you can look at a range of different forms of collaboration, working with a consortium. In an awful lot of EU projects, well, all EU projects will involve some kind of a consortium, so that people work together to develop a technology. Joint ventures, where companies get together to develop something, or you could simply subcontract the piece of work that you want to do and use a contract house. And again, there are quite a few of them around the place, people who are involved in subcontract research and subcontract development. You'd have quite a few design houses. I can't even remember the names of them now, they're just slipping out of my head. So who would look at industrial design, and they would take that on, they'd have a key skill in that. Or software contracting, so very often people would subcontract the development of software out to an external company. So that's another way of acquiring a technology. How do you decide? If you're a company, how do you decide? Are you going to make something? Are you going to source something internally? Or are you going to get it externally? What are your own capabilities? How good, if you are state-of-the-art in developing a particular technology, you're hardly likely to go externally for it. You're more likely to decide to develop it yourself. Company on our doorstep, Analog Devices. Anybody know anyone working for Analog Devices? Yeah. Analog devices really are state of the art in developing ICs. They'll do most of their stuff internally. They'll do a little bit of work with some research centres, with the NMRC, a bit of work with some people here at the university, but by and large they're developing everything themselves. You look at the transaction and the governance costs. So if you're deciding to buy a piece of technology externally, it's never simply like going in and buying a new phone or something like that, because there's a huge amount of time and effort put in by management to actually manage that process, to decide what is the right price, like how much do you pay for new technology. And very often you can't really say, because you don't know how much something is going to be worth, and you're trying to determine how much money has been put into it, how much would we spend to develop it, and it's not always clear. Do you pay for information? How much is, how do you monitor the performance of something? So if you buy a new piece of technology from somebody, do you just pay up front for it, or do you buy it and have some kind of a licensing fee? Is the licensing fee just based on time? Is it based on how much of the product you sell? Is it based on your sales costs or your manufacturing costs or your profit? So there's lots of things that have to be kind of decided around it. You need to commit people to it. So there's lots and lots to do with actually acquiring technology. Again, bigger companies are good at that, and they will have departments set up simply to acquire technology. They'll have departments set up simply to look at what technology is out there and what could we purchase. Dynamic transaction costs, these are kind of ongoing costs, and things like the cost of persuading, negotiating, coordinating, and all those kind of management costs that you'll have to get involved in if you are going to buy or acquire a new piece of technology. And the real thing is, there isn't one best way to do things. It depends on what the company is up to. It depends on what you're at. I suppose that's really just making the point that the company isn't only concerned with the current state of affairs, but its future value as well is very important for a company. The other thing to keep in mind, say when we're looking at how do you make or buy, there is another issue that's mentioned, might be mentioned in the paper that you're reading, a thing called absorptive capacity. Which is really about to what extent is your company able to exploit a new technology that you buy. So you might buy, I can remember years ago, there's a very good example of this, where a company out in Shannon who was making out some kind of a technology decided they wanted to integrate a PC into what they were doing, and they bought the license to have this PC integrated, but they actually didn't have the know-how or the technology internally in the company to make it work. So if they came across any problems, they were scuppered, and the project failed at the end because they didn't have the capacity or the technology know-how within their company to actually make it work. So that's the notion of absorptive capacity, which also has an impact on whether you buy or design technology internally. Okay, I'll just talk a little bit about each of those three processes. I'll focus kind of on the R&D process, and we'll be coming back to that again. But this is if you're developing technology internally as opposed to acquiring it from somewhere else. You'll be involved in research and development. And research and development, there are two sides to it. There's the research, which is making kind of brand new knowledge, new ideas, new materials, new ways of doing things, new software, which is kind of further from, sometimes called blue skies research, where it's kind of not always targeted at a particular market. And then there's the development side, which is really about transforming an idea into something that you can actually make and distribute, and that will work reliably within a customer site. Very often smaller companies will get involved more in development than research, but it's a blurred line anyway between the two. And we're going to look at a couple of kind of models that are around that. First of all, in terms of kind of getting a product from an idea to something that is actually being sent out to a customer, research will happen first, and then development, and then this process that you call commercialization. So companies who are developing a product have a process in place to do that, and they have kind of a well-defined process. This is a very high-level view. It's called a model of open innovation, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but that's often referred to as the R&D or the innovation funnel, because the notion with companies is that you start off with an awful lot of ideas out here at the start, and as you move through kind of researching different ideas and see will they work, a lot of them will fall away because they're not feasible, because they, for whatever reason, the technology doesn't work, or you pick an alternative because you might look at different alternatives of doing things. So as you move along kind of through the research phase, you're narrowing down to what you actually ship out to the customer at the end of the day. So of all the new ideas you get, only a very small proportion of them actually ship out to customers. There's another figure in there that's often quoted, that about 60 or 70 new ideas, well, about 60 or 70 products that get into development get through. The rest of them fail. The rest of them just don't work in the marketplace or never actually get to the marketplace. This particular picture of the innovation funnel is called an open model of innovation, and the reason it's called an open model of innovation is that it's based on work that this guy Henry Chesbrough did, and what he looked at was the fact that previously this would have been just looked at as a funnel, but what he said is that this is actually porous, so that the company, what's in here is what happens within the company, but the company deals with a lot of external organizations as well along that way, and companies are moving towards this notion of open innovation, where they're involving more people in their innovation processes. And again, we can talk a little bit more about that later on. But that's why this is the open innovation model, and why you have these arrows kind of going in and out at the side. Without them, it's just the innovation funnel. So product development, what do companies do if they're developing new products, if they're in the development part of R&D? Normally within a company, it will be well defined into a couple of different steps. So you'll start by kind of coming up with ideas for new products. You'll maybe go and initially assess them and look at the ideas. You might do a feasibility study. You'll then get into the whole area of actually developing those into a product, developing the technology, which might be designing something or writing software or whatever it is. In the food business, it might be coming up with a new recipe. Very often innovation in the food business is about packaging, how things are packaged. You test it and pilot test it and make sure it can be manufactured and make sure that customers can buy it and all that kind of stuff. And then actually ramp up to production and to actually sending something out to customers. So that's a very standard process that any company, whether you're a medical devices company or a food company or somebody making household goods or whatever, if you're developing new products, you'll be going through some form of that. A couple of years back, a guy called Bob Cooper came up with a model for developing new products, which he called the stage gate process, or the stage gate model, and that's one of the tools that we'll look at later on in the course. And what Bob Cooper said was that, okay, he'd find it phases. So where in the previous model you had ideation, detailed investigation, and so on, Bob Cooper says you come up with a business concept, you develop the business case for that. So there's no point in developing something unless you know it's going to make you money, and you have to put the marketing around that and everything else. You actually develop the product, you test it, you launch it, and then there are some things that happen post-launch. So that's his process. So every company will have a slightly different form of this, but more or less following the same process. The other thing that Bob Cooper put in place was this notion of gates. So if you're developing something, you just don't start at the beginning and go through until you're finished at the end. But after each of these stages, you stop and you evaluate the project. So a gate typically would be a meeting of top management within a company who would review what has happened to date on a particular project and decide to either go ahead with the project, to kill the project altogether and say, no, we're not going to do any more work on that, or to recycle it, to say, go back and do more work and we'll see if it can go through. Most of the bigger companies would be doing this. So most big companies would have gates. One of the biggest issues for a lot of companies is that it's very difficult to actually kill a project. So in a lot of companies, once a project is going, it tends to just keep moving forward. People are very reluctant to say, no, stop all work on that, it's not making sense, because very often they've put in so much effort into it already. But we'll come back to that again in a couple of weeks, the whole notion of a stage gate process. Have you ever, you do design, isn't there? Design in technology. Do you learn about any of that? No? Anybody do technology as a leaving cert subject? Do you do innovation? You do a bit about innovation processes, do you? No. Okay. Was it on the syllabus though? No? Okay, right, yeah. Okay. I'm actually an awful lot of my research is in this area about how companies do that. And companies spend an awful lot of money. It's an expensive process. It's a very expensive process to develop a new product. So people put a lot of effort into trying to get it right and make sure that you're doing it efficiently. But if you're developing a product, the other notion is that not all innovation or not all products are at the same level. So you would tend to look at things in three different layers as either incremental products, so things that are just slightly different from what they were before, platform products where you're kind of coming up with a new technology platform, but it's essentially the same functionality, or something that's radical, okay, something that is totally different that hasn't been done before. And what I'm going to get you to do now, just to make sure everybody's still awake, in groups of about 2 or 3, just as you're sitting, will each of you come up with, from 3 different industries, an incremental, a platform, and a radical product. And tell me why it's incremental, why it's radical, or why it's platform. Any ideas? Like which? It would, absolutely, yeah. Sometimes that might be a platform, but that would tend to be something that's incremental. It's just slightly different, a slight improvement. Incremental is something that's just slightly different. So an example here is iPhone 1 to iPhone 2 would be something that's a slight improvement on something else. Platform is a bigger change than than incremental, but not as big as radical. So a platform development could be a new version of a car. You know, sometimes they come out with a totally. I'm not into cars. Anybody into cars? It's not. It does the same thing. But it's a new style. It might use a new technology within it, but it's not something that's totally radical and totally different. Yeah, just a couple of examples so that we can see what we mean by these things. Are you all right? Can you think of? Yeah.
Is it a change to what the company is using?
Yeah, this is really about the amount of change, isn't it? So if you're a company that's making, say, runners, you know, every year we look at what Nike or Adidas or whatever have. This year's runner is slightly different from last year's runner. So that's an incremental change. But something that might be a platform change might be is if they decide to come out with something that's totally different, you know, that, I don't know, what do they do in running shoes? Well, you know, maybe a totally new material that has never been done before, and it's a big launch because it's something that's quite different. It's still a shoe, but it's something that's quite different. Radical in terms of shoes, I'm hard to think of what could be radical in terms of kind of something like running shoes. But radical, it would tend to be something that's totally new to the market.
Company that made runners going on to like tennis rackets.
Possibly, yeah, and coming up with a totally different design of a tennis racket. So a couple of good examples of radical innovation. One would be the impact that the internet had on the travel business. So that a radical innovation is something that's supposed to disrupt a marketplace, that makes the market have to work differently. So when the internet came along, there was a totally different view to how you book travel and how people book holidays. So that was a radical innovation in that particular industry.
Would that be with tablets?
Yeah, but it wasn't there. It was a radical innovation in the terms of the impact that it had on them. Okay, so it was quite different for them. Another radical innovation. There's there's a good example of radical innovation in the whole telephone exchange business. There's, previously, up to about 10, 15 years ago, companies like Siemens went in and installed big telephone exchanges into places like this, like the university, where you've kind of hundreds of extension lines, and you had to buy a big piece of equipment that cost, hundreds of thousands of euros, and Siemens installed the whole thing, and they maintained it and everything for you. But then, with people using voice over protocols and internet protocols, the need to have that big, piece of installation totally was eliminated. So you could now do the whole thing with a laptop. So that was a radical innovation. How that whole market worked changed. So I don't know what other radical innovations. Yeah, that would be a radical innovation. But I mean, other areas of radical innovation could be things like functional foods. That people were buying yogurt just because it's yogurt. But now they're selling yogurt because it's actually going to do something for you, because it's going to have a real impact on your health, a significant impact on your health. So that's radical in that you're changing how you're selling something.
Travel be radical.
The impact that the internet had on travel.
No, it's travel generally.
Well, give me an example.
So I was back before people used to ride on horses.
Oh yeah, like the car was radical, wasn't it? It totally changed. It was radical in that it changed the way society operated. And the airplane was radical. And Ryanair is often cited as being radical in terms of airline travel.
They're only radical. They're more flexible, aren't they? Because they're changing planes, bigger planes.
Well, no. They didn't. It wasn't the planes that Ryanair changed. It was the business model that Ryanair changed. Ryanair changed how you sell flights and how people value flights. So Ryanair changed travel in that they changed it from where people, when I was younger, long ago, you didn't fly places. It was a big deal to get on a plane and fly places. You didn't just get on your plane and fly to Spain for your holidays, because it was, the cost of flights, it was hundreds of pounds, which in those days was a huge amount of money. So it was like having to pay €500-600 or more to get on any plane anyway. So people just didn't do it. But Ryanair had a radical change on that business model, in that they said, and again, when I, 20-30 years ago, if you were flying, you had air hostesses bringing you free drink, it's great. That was standard part of your ticket. You always got a meal. You always got, looked after. They came out and gave you sweets and all that kind of thing. So the whole package they were selling is very different from how you're selling it now. And you got your ticket, and it was a big deal to fly on a plane. But Ryanair changed the way that industry operated, in that they said, we're going to make flying on a plane the same as getting on a train. And they changed it so that you didn't have seat numbers, that you paid, maybe tens of euro for a flight instead of hundreds of euro for a flight. You got no service per se. You paid for everything. Even coming in and paying for your baggage. 10 years ago, you didn't pay for your baggage.
Only really were paying for so was just the travel of going from here to there.
But they changed the model. They changed how you look at air travel. Any other radical change? Anybody else got examples of radical innovation? Yeah, that's radical, all right. Anything else? So what's happening now that's quite radical? To make a smart card, yeah, that would have been a radical innovation for them, definitely. What about now on television? They're switching off all the analog signals, so everything is going digital. So that's quite radical in how we look at television. And within that whole industry, that's radical. And also the fact, I think I mentioned last week, that we're not looking, an awful lot of the television we're getting now over the internet as well. So there's lots of change going on there, and that's going to have a big impact on how that industry operates. Anything else radical?
Milking machine.
Yeah, go on.
No,
Actually, when they were introduced, yeah, absolutely, yeah, it totally changed that whole sector, that whole industry sector. Any incremental innovations then? A new edition of a book, that's incremental. Moving your book to being, a web-enabled thing with hyperlinks, that's radical. Anybody else with maybe something that's incremental?
That's just caravan to issues.
Yeah, that could be incremental. Or it might be platform as well, depending on the nature of change.
Where we sit here on the platform, say, new engine size and stuff like that.
Absolutely, and that's it, yeah. So that your platform will very often when you develop a platform, it's something that you can launch a lot of incremental innovations off. So if you have a platform, it's like, as you say, maybe a new engine or a new technology, and based on that, then you can come up with lots of incremental stuff. But it's fundamentally doing the same thing. Whereas radical is something, again, the definition of radical is that it disrupts the marketplace, it disrupts how people actually use your product and what people do with products. There's lots of interesting stuff on that, and if we get to it, we'll have a look. Because in radical innovations, a radical innovation will very often start kind of on the margins of a technology. So it'll be something that most people who are using that technology don't do, but it starts as kind of being something insignificant. But the take-up of the technology is very, very rapid. So all of a sudden, everybody is using them. The Walkman is an example of a radical innovation. That suddenly you could wear the music you were bringing with you, which was very different. Okay, so that's good. We got that. When you're developing a product, the level of change is important, okay, in the product. And we talked a lot about level of change, but the level of change in the process is always so very important. So if you're a company developing new products, this is a product process development, so just looking at it, but that's often called a portfolio. That's to look at your portfolio of products. So if you're a company that has a lot of different products, would you be happy if all your products were down here? Yes, no, maybe? Why not? You're not moving forward, yeah. So you're very likely to be taken over by your competition. Would you be happy if all your products were up here? Why not?
Too expensive.
Which?
Be too expensive.
It'd be very expensive. Any other reason to be unhappy if everything is up here?
Depends on the time now.
Yeah, it does depend on the time. We'll have a look at something related to that in a minute. Yeah, your market is because you're developing new markets all the time. Because this is looking at new markets, so it takes a while. There's a lot of cost involved. Any other reason?
You're adding complication to the company.
Yeah.
You'd be always looking at different things, like different projects.
Yeah, you wouldn't have any kind of clear strategy.
Yeah. Same area, like.
Yeah, you could be kind of not a clear development area or a clear strategy. You'd be all over the place. But the word I was looking for was risk. Up here is very risky. If you're developing products that are using totally new technologies and totally different ways of doing things, that's very, very risky. And your chances of having things to be successful and to work well up here are lower than having something that's going to work well down here. So in terms of risk, what do you think the best thing for a company to do is then? A combination, yeah. So companies will manage a portfolio of products that probably most of them are down here, some are up here, and then some are up here again. And notice as well, something can be radical in terms of the actual product. So we had a lot of examples of things like that. What are examples of radical new products? Things like the Walkman, or I suppose something like travel in terms of how it was. Although travel you could say was process as well. Or you could look where the process is totally different. And certainly, say bookshops that have gone totally online, they're still selling books. But the process of doing that is quite radical, and how you have to structure your company is very, very different. If you move from being, a company selling books to a company with an online bookshop. Anybody from Galway? Kenny's bookshop closed, didn't they? And they went totally online. So that was radical for Kenny's. But it wasn't that they were selling anything different, but their process was totally different. So for the company, that was a radical change. Yeah, it's just gone 10 to now, so we'll leave it at that. So on Friday, I'll pick up from this on Friday. We'll have to do it, and we'll look at Moodle on Friday as well, and you'll get access to the notes then at that stage. Oh yeah, sure. I'm seeing you tomorrow morning as well, and we're going to focus on the case on your assignment tomorrow morning. I think it's in. Have you not got a timetable with you? Oh. No, sorry, guys, you do have a tutorial tomorrow, just because we've a lot to cover, and I want to give you a bit of hand in doing that case study. It's in P1031, as far as I know. P1031. Yeah, it is, yeah. It's 9 to 11 tomorrow. It is, because you're not...